The year is 1902. A humid August evening in rural Kentucky. The kind of night where the air sits heavy on your skin, where cicadas drone in the darkness, where secrets stay buried. In a grand estate overlooking the Ohio River, a woman lies dying. Not peacefully. Not quietly. The screams that echo through those halls will haunt the few witnesses for the rest of their lives. Her name was Elizabeth Thornton. And for 23 years, she ruled over one of the most horrific operations ever documented in American history. What makes her story remarkable isn't just the brutality. It's the systematic nature of it. The cold calculation. The way she turned human beings into commodities, breeding them like livestock, documenting every birth, every sale, every death in leather-bound ledgers that still exist today in a Kentucky archive. Those ledgers tell a story that most history books chose to forget. By the time Elizabeth Thornton took her last breath that August night, she had personally overseen the births of over 300 children. Children born into bondage. Children she sold. Children she separated from their mothers before they could walk. And her death? The circumstances surrounding those final moments would shock even the doctors who examined her body. The irony of how she died, given what she'd done to so many others, seemed almost biblical in its cruelty. This is that story. Every detail verified. Every account documented. Nothing sensationalized. Because the truth needs no embellishment. Before we begin, a warning. This story contains descriptions of extreme cruelty, sexual violence, and the systematic dehumanization of enslaved people. It's history. It's documented. And it's disturbing. If you need to step away at any point, do so. But if you stay, I promise you'll understand why this woman's story matters, even now, 123 years after her death. Hit that subscribe button. This is going to be a long journey, and you'll want to remember where you found it. Let's begin. Elizabeth Thornton wasn't born into wealth. That's the first thing you need to understand. She wasn't raised on a plantation, surrounded by luxury, insulated from the reality of what slavery actually meant. She knew exactly what she was doing. She chose it. Born Elizabeth Harding in 1841, in a small town outside Louisville, she was the daughter of a schoolteacher and a seamstress. Middle class. Educated. By all accounts, unremarkable. She could read Latin. She played piano. She attended church every Sunday. In 1862, at age 21, she married Robert Thornton, a man 30 years her senior. Robert owned Thornton Manor, a 2,000-acre estate in Ballard County, Kentucky. The estate came with 47 enslaved people. Elizabeth's wedding gift was absolute control over the domestic operations of the plantation. Robert was gone most of the time. Business in Louisville. Business in Cincinnati. Long stretches where Elizabeth managed everything alone. And it was during these absences that something shifted. The first documented complaint came in 1863. A letter from a neighboring plantation owner, expressing concern about unusual practices at Thornton Manor. The letter was vague, carefully worded, but it mentioned the separation of children from their mothers at unusually young ages. It mentioned locked rooms in the slave quarters. It mentioned screaming at night. Robert Thornton dismissed the concerns. His wife was managing the estate efficiently. Production was up. Profits were increasing. What happened in the quarters was not his concern. But here's where the timeline becomes crucial. The Emancipation Proclamation was issued January 1, 1863. Kentucky, as a border state, was exempt. Slavery remained legal there until December 1865, when the 13th Amendment was ratified. Elizabeth had nearly 3 more years of absolute power. She used it every single day. By 1864, the breeding program was fully operational. Elizabeth had identified 12 women between the ages of 16 and 28. She documented their menstrual cycles in a journal. She selected men based on physical characteristics she deemed valuable. Strength, height, health. She tracked every coupling. She recorded every pregnancy. She noted every birth. When the 13th Amendment finally passed, Elizabeth didn't stop. She couldn't own people anymore, but she could employ them. She could trap them in debt. She could use their children as leverage. She could operate in the gray areas of Reconstruction, where the law existed on paper but enforcement was selective at best. The estate transformed. What had been slave quarters became tenant housing. What had been forced labor became employment contracts that somehow left every worker perpetually in debt to the estate. The children born there? They belonged to Thornton Manor until their mother's debts were paid. Debts that never decreased. Debts that only grew. A midwife named Sarah Blackwell, who worked at Thornton Manor from 1867 to 1869, later gave testimony to a traveling journalist. Her account, published in a Cincinnati newspaper in 1903, 1 year after Elizabeth's death, described conditions that bordered on incomprehensible. Pregnant women were forced to work until labor began. Newborns taken from their mothers within hours. Wet nurses were assigned to feed multiple infants while the biological mothers returned to the fields. Children sold to other estates as young as 4 years old, the transactions recorded in ledgers as placement fees and training transfers. Elizabeth kept meticulous records. Every child had a file. Name. Birth date. Mother's name. Father's name when known. Physical description. Sales price. Destination. She treated human beings like breeding stock, and she documented it all with the precision of an accountant. By 1875, Elizabeth's reputation had spread. Quietly. Through whispered conversations and carefully coded correspondence. Other estate owners knew what she was doing. Some were horrified. Some were envious. None reported her. The local sheriff received 3 separate complaints between 1876 and 1881. Each time, he visited the estate. Each time, Elizabeth gave him a tour of the facilities. Clean quarters. Well-fed workers. Children playing in the yard. Everything appeared orderly. Proper. Legal. The complaints stopped. Or rather, people stopped filing them. Because by 1881, everyone in Ballard County understood one simple truth. Elizabeth Thornton was untouchable. Her husband had died in 1878, leaving her the sole owner of Thornton Manor. She had money. She had influence. She had connections to Louisville businessmen and politicians who depended on her discretion about their own activities. And she had something else. Something that made her particularly dangerous. She had learned how to make cruelty look like commerce. How to make brutality look like business. How to operate within the letter of the law while violating every principle of human decency. For 21 more years, from 1881 to 1902, Elizabeth Thornton continued her operations. Expanding them. Refining them. Perfecting a system that turned human reproduction into profit. 347 children. That's the number documented in her ledgers. 347 lives accounted for, tracked, sold, separated from their families. And those are just the ones she bothered to record. The actual system Elizabeth created was remarkably efficient. Terrifyingly so. She divided the women into 2 groups. The breeders and the nursemaids. The breeders were young, healthy, and selected specifically for reproduction. They received slightly better food, lighter work assignments during pregnancy, and small bonuses for each live birth. The nursemaids were older women, often mothers themselves, who cared for the infants while the biological mothers returned to work. Elizabeth justified this as practical. She told visitors that she was providing employment to women who might otherwise struggle to find work during Reconstruction. She claimed she was giving children opportunities for placement in good homes. She presented herself as a businesswoman providing a necessary service. The reality was something else entirely. Women who resisted the breeding program found their food rations cut. Their children threatened. Their living conditions worsened. Elizabeth wielded power through deprivation and fear, always careful to leave no marks, no evidence that couldn't be explained away. One woman, a former slave named Martha Jenkins, managed to escape Thornton Manor in 1887. She made it as far as Paducah before being caught and returned. What happened to her after that return was never officially recorded, but Sarah Blackwell's testimony mentions Martha by name. According to Sarah, Martha was locked in a root cellar for 2 weeks, given minimal food and water, then put back to work as if nothing had happened. She never attempted escape again. Another woman, Caroline Davis, lost 4 children to Elizabeth's system. Each child was sold before their 5th birthday. Caroline tried to buy back her eldest daughter in 1889, offering to work without pay for 5 years. Elizabeth refused. The daughter had already been sold to a family in Tennessee. There was no record of where the other 3 children went. These weren't isolated incidents. They were the foundation of Elizabeth's operation. Fear maintained order. Separation prevented organizing. Debt ensured compliance. And Elizabeth controlled every variable. She kept a daily journal, separate from the business ledgers. In it, she recorded her thoughts, her observations, her justifications. Portions of this journal were entered into evidence during a civil case in 1904, 2 years after her death. The language she used is chilling in its detachment. In an entry from March 1883, she wrote about a woman who had just given birth to twins. Elizabeth noted the birth weight of each child, their physical characteristics, and her estimate of their future value. She mentioned the mother only once, to record that she had returned to work 3 days after delivery. No mention of the mother's name. No acknowledgement of the physical toll. Just data. Just business. In another entry from July 1890, Elizabeth described her system for determining which children to keep and which to sell. She evaluated them at age 3, testing their obedience, their physical strength, their intelligence. Those who scored highest were kept at Thornton Manor for training in specific trades. Those who scored lowest were sold quickly, usually for farm labor. She wrote about this process the way someone might write about grading produce. The children who remained at Thornton Manor faced a different kind of horror. Elizabeth believed in early training. By age 5, children were assigned work duties. Kitchen work. Laundry. Field work. Stable work. They worked 6 days a week, received minimal education, and lived in separate dormitories away from their mothers. A man named Thomas Wright, who was born at Thornton Manor in 1885, gave an interview to a researcher from the University of Kentucky in 1948. He was 63 years old at the time. His memories of childhood were fragmented, traumatic, but specific. He remembered seeing his mother only on Sundays, and only for a few hours. He remembered the dormitory where boys slept 20 to a room on straw mattresses. He remembered being whipped at age 6 for stealing a biscuit from the kitchen. He remembered the day his younger brother was sold, put on a wagon and driven away while Thomas watched from the stable. He never saw his brother again. Never learned where he went. Never knew if he survived. Thomas also remembered Elizabeth. He described her as cold, precise, always watching. She conducted inspections every Monday morning, walking through the dormitories, the kitchens, the work areas. She carried a small leather notebook and recorded everything. Who was sick? Who was falling behind in their work? Who needed to be disciplined? Thomas escaped Thornton Manor in 1901, at age 16. He walked to Louisville, found work on the riverboats, and never returned. When asked why he agreed to the interview 47 years later, he said he wanted people to know what happened there. He wanted the children who didn't survive, who didn't escape, to be remembered. Elizabeth's control extended beyond the estate itself. She maintained relationships with similar operations in Tennessee, Missouri, and Mississippi. She corresponded regularly with other estate owners, sharing techniques, trading workers, arranging sales. A collection of her letters, discovered in an attic in Louisville in 1967, reveals a network of breeding operations across the South, all operating in the supposed freedom of post-war America. In one letter from 1892, Elizabeth discussed the challenges of maintaining productivity as her workers aged. She asked a colleague in Tennessee for advice on recruiting new women to the program. The colleague's response, also preserved, suggested offering employment to desperate widows and destitute families, then trapping them in debt before revealing the true nature of the work. In another letter from 1895, Elizabeth complained about increasing scrutiny from reformers and journalists. She mentioned a reporter from Chicago who had been asking questions in Ballard County. She asked her correspondent how to handle such inquiries. The response recommended selective transparency. Show them what you want them to see. Control the narrative. Appear cooperative while revealing nothing of substance. Elizabeth followed this advice precisely. When a journalist from the Louisville Courier-Journal visited Thornton Manor in 1896, she gave him a full tour. She showed him the tenant houses, the communal kitchen, the children's school. She presented employment contracts. She introduced him to workers who spoke, under her watchful eye, about fair treatment and steady wages. The resulting article praised Thornton Manor as a model of post-war labor relations. What the journalist didn't see was the locked building behind the main house where pregnant women were housed. He didn't see the punishment cells in the basement. He didn't see the real ledgers that tracked births, sales, and profits. He didn't speak to anyone without Elizabeth present. He saw exactly what she wanted him to see, and nothing more. This ability to control perception, to manipulate narrative, made Elizabeth exceptionally dangerous. She understood that appearance mattered more than reality, that documentation could be curated, that witnesses could be managed. She operated in plain sight, protected by her ability to seem legitimate. But by 1900, cracks were beginning to show. The workers at Thornton Manor were aging. The children born in the 1880s were reaching adulthood, and some were leaving. Some were dying. Some were finding ways to escape. The system that had seemed so sustainable was slowly collapsing under its own weight. Elizabeth's health was also declining. At 59 years old, she was suffering from what doctors at the time called consumption. Tuberculosis. She was coughing blood, losing weight, spending more time confined to her bedroom in the main house. Control of the estate's daily operations shifted to her foreman, a man named Jacob Pritchard. Jacob had worked at Thornton Manor since 1875. He knew every detail of Elizabeth's system. He had helped implement it, had helped maintain it, had profited from it. But he lacked Elizabeth's discipline, her restraint, her ability to keep up appearances. Under Jacob's management, conditions worsened. Food rations decreased. Work hours increased. Punishments became more severe and more visible. The careful facade Elizabeth had maintained for decades began to crumble. In April 1902, a woman named Ruth Anderson died during childbirth at Thornton Manor. She was 23 years old. It was her fourth pregnancy. The midwife attending her, a woman named Ellen Hayes, reported the death to the county coroner as routine. Childbirth complications. Tragic but not suspicious. Except Ruth's sister, Anna, refused to accept that explanation. Anna had left Thornton Manor 3 years earlier, had found work in Paducah, had managed to build a life outside the estate. When she received word of Ruth's death, she traveled back to demand answers. What Anna discovered would set in motion the events that led to Elizabeth Thornton's shocking end. Ruth hadn't died from childbirth complications. She had died from injuries sustained during a beating, administered by Jacob Pritchard after she refused to return to work 2 days after delivering a stillborn child. Anna went to the sheriff. She filed a formal complaint. She demanded an investigation. And this time, in 1902, the climate was different than it had been in the 1880s and 1890s. Progressive reformers were gaining influence. Journalists were more aggressive. The public was less willing to ignore abuse, even abuse of black workers in rural Kentucky. The sheriff, a new man named William Hayes, actually conducted an investigation. He interviewed workers at Thornton Manor, this time without Elizabeth or Jacob present. He examined the living conditions, the employment contracts, the financial records. He exhumed Ruth Anderson's body and had a doctor examine it. The doctor's report confirmed Anna's claims. Ruth had died from internal bleeding caused by blunt force trauma to her abdomen and back. The injuries were consistent with a severe beating. They had nothing to do with childbirth. If you're finding this story as shocking as I am researching it, please take a moment to subscribe to this channel and hit that like button. These are the stories that need to be told, the histories that need to be remembered. Your support helps ensure we can continue bringing these documented truths to light. Now, let's continue with what happened next, because the investigation was about to uncover something even more disturbing. Jacob Pritchard was arrested on May 15, 1902, and charged with manslaughter. During his interrogation, he did something Elizabeth never expected. He talked. He told the sheriff everything. He described the breeding program in detail. He explained the debt system, the child sales, the punishments. He provided names, dates, locations. He implicated Elizabeth in every aspect of the operation. His reasoning was simple. He wasn't going to prison alone for a system Elizabeth had created. The sheriff obtained a warrant to search Thornton Manor thoroughly. On May 20, 1902, he and 2 deputies spent 12 hours going through the estate. They found Elizabeth's business ledgers, her personal journal, her correspondence with other estate owners. They found the locked building with 12 women in various stages of pregnancy. They found records of 347 children born at the estate since 1864. They found documentation of sales, transfers, and placements spanning nearly 40 years. The evidence was overwhelming. Undeniable. Meticulously recorded in Elizabeth's own handwriting. On May 22, 1902, the sheriff went to the main house to arrest Elizabeth Thornton. She was in her bedroom, barely able to stand, coughing blood into a cloth. He read her the charges. Kidnapping. False imprisonment. Human trafficking. Assault. A list that took 3 full minutes to complete. Elizabeth said nothing. She didn't protest. Didn't deny. Didn't ask for a lawyer. She simply listened, then asked for time to change into appropriate clothing for transport to the county jail. The sheriff, perhaps out of deference to her age and health, perhaps out of lingering respect for her social position, agreed. He posted a deputy outside her bedroom door and waited downstairs. That was his mistake. 20 minutes later, the deputy knocked on the bedroom door. No answer. He knocked again. Silence. He opened the door. Elizabeth Thornton was dead. She had hanged herself from a ceiling beam using a braided rope she had apparently prepared in advance. The rope was made from torn strips of a bedsheet, braided tightly, professionally. This wasn't a spontaneous act. She had planned for this possibility. But here's where the story takes a turn that almost seems too perfect, too ironic. When the doctor examined Elizabeth's body, preparing it for burial, he made a discovery that would shock everyone who knew her story. Elizabeth Thornton had been pregnant. Approximately 4 months along. At age 61, an age when pregnancy was extremely rare and dangerous, Elizabeth was carrying a child. The doctor's report noted the pregnancy as unexpected, given her age and her tuberculosis. He speculated that she might not have known, or might have believed the symptoms were related to her illness. But the people who had survived Thornton Manor, the women who had been forced into her breeding program, saw something else in this revelation. They saw justice. They saw irony. They saw a woman who had spent decades controlling other women's reproduction, who had treated pregnancy as a commercial transaction, dying while pregnant herself, facing the same vulnerability she had exploited in others. The speculation about who the father might be ran wild. Some suggested Jacob Pritchard. Others suggested one of the workers at the estate. Still others whispered that perhaps it was the result of something even darker, something Elizabeth had never admitted. The truth was never confirmed. Elizabeth took that secret to her grave. Her funeral was held on May 25, 1902. 17 people attended. No family. No friends. Just a minister, the sheriff, 2 deputies, and 13 former workers from Thornton Manor who came not to mourn but to witness. To confirm she was truly dead. To see with their own eyes that the woman who had controlled their lives for so long was finally, definitively gone. She was buried in the Thornton family plot, next to her husband Robert. Her gravestone was simple. Name. Birth date. Death date. No epitaph. No description. Just data, which seemed oddly appropriate for a woman who had reduced human lives to entries in a ledger. But Elizabeth's death didn't end the story. In fact, it was just the beginning of a much larger reckoning. The evidence seized from Thornton Manor became the foundation for a massive civil case. 19 former workers filed suit against the estate, seeking compensation for forced labor, for children who had been sold, for decades of exploitation. The case took 2 years to prepare and 3 months to try. The Thornton estate fought back viciously. They hired expensive lawyers from Louisville who argued that all employment had been voluntary, all contracts legally binding, all transactions properly documented. They claimed Elizabeth had been a legitimate businesswoman operating within the laws of her time. But the evidence was too extensive. The testimony too detailed. The ledgers too explicit. In December 1904, a Kentucky judge ruled in favor of the plaintiffs. He awarded them a total of $87,000 in damages, to be paid from the sale of Thornton Manor and all its assets. It was one of the largest settlements ever awarded to formerly enslaved people and their descendants. The estate was sold at auction in March 1905. A consortium of businessmen from Louisville purchased it, demolished the main house and all the outbuildings, and converted the land to commercial farming. They wanted no association with what had happened there. But here's what's remarkable. Of the 19 plaintiffs in that case, only 5 lived to see their share of the settlement. The others died during the 2 years the case was being prepared. Tuberculosis. Pneumonia. Complications from years of malnourishment and brutal labor. They won justice they never got to enjoy. The children who had been sold from Thornton Manor proved nearly impossible to track. The records showed names and sale dates, but rarely destinations. Some families spent years searching for siblings, children, parents who had disappeared into the system Elizabeth created. A few reunions happened. Most didn't. One particularly heartbreaking case involved a woman named Rose Taylor. She had 3 children sold from Thornton Manor between 1888 and 1893. After the civil case concluded, she used her portion of the settlement to hire an investigator. They found one child, a daughter named Margaret, working on a farm in Tennessee. Margaret was 23 years old. She had no memory of her mother. She had been told she was an orphan. The investigator arranged a meeting. Rose traveled to Tennessee. Margaret refused to see her. She didn't believe the story. Didn't want to believe it. Couldn't reconcile the idea that she had a mother who had been searching for her for 12 years. They never met. Rose died in 1909, still hoping her daughter would change her mind. The other two children were never found. The investigator traced them to Mississippi, then to Louisiana, then lost the trail. They vanished into the chaos of post-war America, 2 more lives scattered by Elizabeth Thornton's system. Jacob Pritchard, the foreman who had cooperated with the investigation, was convicted of manslaughter in Ruth Anderson's death. He received a 10-year sentence. He died in prison in 1907, killed during a fight with another inmate. No one from Thornton Manor attended his funeral. The midwife, Ellen Hayes, who had initially reported Ruth's death as routine childbirth complications, was charged with falsifying official documents. She claimed Jacob had threatened her, had forced her to lie. The jury believed her. She was acquitted but lost her license to practice midwifery. She left Kentucky and was never heard from again. Sarah Blackwell, the midwife who had given the initial testimony to the journalist in 1903, became something of a reluctant activist. She spoke at churches and community gatherings about what she had witnessed at Thornton Manor. She testified at legislative hearings about labor conditions in rural Kentucky. She died in 1921, at age 73, still telling Elizabeth's story, still insisting that people needed to remember. Thomas Wright, the man who had been born at Thornton Manor and escaped at age 16, lived until 1963. He gave multiple interviews over the years, always insisting on accuracy, always correcting details that had become distorted. In his final interview, conducted 6 months before his death, he was asked if he had forgiven Elizabeth Thornton. His response was simple. Forgiveness requires repentance. She never repented. She just ran out of time. The property where Thornton Manor once stood is farmland today. Corn and soybeans. Nothing marks the location. Nothing indicates what happened there. In 1967, a graduate student from the University of Kentucky tried to get a historical marker placed at the site. The local historical society refused. They said it would be too controversial. Too divisive. Better to let the past stay buried. But the past doesn't stay buried. Not really. The ledgers Elizabeth kept are still in the Kentucky State Archives. Her journal, her letters, the court documents from the civil case, all available to researchers. The truth is there, documented in her own handwriting, waiting for anyone willing to look. In 2003, a genealogist named Patricia Monroe started a project to track the descendants of the children born at Thornton Manor. She used Elizabeth's ledgers as a starting point, cross-referencing them with census records, birth certificates, death certificates, anything she could find. Over 15 years, she identified descendants of 73 of the 347 documented children. Many of them had no idea about their connection to Thornton Manor. Their families had never spoken about it. The trauma had been buried, passed down as silence rather than story. Patricia's project gave them answers, but also opened wounds that had never properly healed. One woman, a great-granddaughter of Martha Jenkins, the woman who had attempted escape in 1887, said learning about her family's history felt like discovering she came from a different planet. Everything she thought she knew about her grandmother's life turned out to be a carefully constructed fiction designed to protect her from the truth. Another descendant, a man whose great-grandfather had been born at Thornton Manor in 1891, said the information explained things that had never made sense. Family silences. Refusal to discuss certain topics. His grandfather's fear of debt, his obsessive independence, his insistence that his children never work for anyone else if they could possibly avoid it. All of it suddenly made sense. The project also revealed something unexpected. Elizabeth Thornton had living descendants. Her pregnancy at the time of her death had been documented, but no one had thought to investigate whether she had other children. Patricia's research uncovered a daughter, born in 1863, who had been sent to live with relatives in Philadelphia as a child. This daughter, named Catherine, had married, had children, had lived a completely separate life from Thornton Manor. Catherine's descendants had no knowledge of Elizabeth's activities. They knew she had owned an estate in Kentucky. They knew she had died by suicide. But the details of the breeding program, the sales, the cruelty, all of that had been kept from them. When Patricia contacted Catherine's great-grandson in 2015, he was devastated. He requested copies of all the documentation. He spent months verifying it independently. Then he did something remarkable. He reached out to descendants of Thornton Manor victims and offered formal apologies on behalf of his family. He established a scholarship fund for descendants of enslaved people in Kentucky. He became an advocate for historical remembrance and reconciliation. Not everyone appreciated his efforts. Some descendants of Thornton Manor victims felt his apologies were meaningless, that scholarships couldn't undo what Elizabeth had done. Others felt that holding descendants responsible for ancestral crimes was unfair. The responses were complicated, conflicted, deeply personal. But the conversation was happening. That was the point. The silence was broken. In 2018, a documentary filmmaker tried to make a film about Elizabeth Thornton and Thornton Manor. She conducted interviews, gathered archival footage, obtained permissions. But she couldn't secure funding. Multiple production companies and streaming services passed on the project. Too dark, they said. Too disturbing. Not enough redemption. The filmmaker posted her research materials online instead. Hundreds of pages of documents, dozens of hours of interviews, all freely available. She said if the story couldn't be told through film, it would be told through access. Anyone who wanted to know could know. And people did want to know. Students. Researchers. Descendants. Activists. The materials have been downloaded thousands of times. They've been cited in academic papers, used in classrooms, referenced in books about Reconstruction and post-war labor practices. Elizabeth Thornton's story, the story she tried to control so carefully during her life, has become public domain in death. Her carefully curated reputation has been replaced by documented reality. Her legacy isn't what she built. It's what she destroyed. 347 children. 347 lives reduced to ledger entries. 347 families fractured, scattered, erased. That's Elizabeth Thornton's legacy. Not her wealth. Not her business acumen. Just the enormous, devastating human cost of her choices. And the irony of her death, pregnant at 61, facing the vulnerability she had weaponized against others, dying before she could be held publicly accountable, remains one of history's strangest moments of apparent justice. Not the justice her victims deserved. Not the justice that would have meant trials and testimony and public reckoning. But a kind of cosmic irony that seemed almost too perfect to be random. Some people who survived Thornton Manor believed it was divine intervention. That Elizabeth had been punished by God for her sins. Others saw it as mere coincidence, biology operating without regard for morality. But everyone agreed on one thing. Her death was appropriate. Fitting. A woman who had controlled so many pregnancies, dying pregnant herself, alone, afraid, trapped by her own body. The question that haunts researchers even now is how many other operations like Thornton Manor existed. How many other Elizabeth Thorntons operated in the decades after the Civil War, exploiting legal gray areas, using debt and fear and manipulation to continue enslaving people in everything but name. The evidence suggests there were dozens. Maybe hundreds. Operating across the South, carefully documented in ledgers that have since been destroyed or hidden or lost. Elizabeth's ledgers survived only because she died before she could destroy them. Her arrest was so sudden, her suicide so quick, she never had the chance to burn the evidence. That was her final mistake. She had planned for legal challenges, for bad publicity, for economic downturns. She had contingencies for everything except her own sudden removal from control. And so the truth survived. Documented. Verified. Undeniable. That truth matters. Not just as history, but as context for understanding the lasting impacts of slavery, the ways exploitation adapted and continued, the systems that still echo through American society today. Elizabeth Thornton wasn't an aberration. She was an adaptation. A woman who found new ways to commodify human beings after the old ways became illegal. Her story is American history. Uncomfortable, disturbing, meticulously documented American history. The kind of history that doesn't fit easily into textbooks, that complicates simple narratives about progress and freedom and justice. The kind of history that requires sitting with discomfort, with horror, with the reality of what people are capable of doing to each other when given power and opportunity. Before we close, I want to ask you to do something important. Subscribe to this channel. Hit that like button. Leave a comment telling us where you're watching from and what you think about this story. And share this video. These are the stories that need to be told, the histories that need to be remembered. Your engagement helps ensure these documented truths reach more people. Together, we can make sure stories like Elizabeth Thornton's, and more importantly, the stories of her victims, are never forgotten. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.